Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LCK week number 8 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. Sorry for this coming out a day late. There's just been a lot going on right now. Obviously, you guys know this isn't my full-time job, so I try to get these out as quickly as possible with playoffs and a lot of other regions. We've had to move around the schedule, and there's just been a lot of chaos going on, so I do appreciate you sticking through it and you know, being all right with it coming out a day late here, but we are going to get into LCK week number 8. This is a very important week because remember, we've only got 2 more weeks left of the regular season, including this one. By the end of this, we are going to know most of the teams that are locked into the playoffs. Not that we already don't, but we're going to know how close we are to potentially maybe all of the teams being locked into the playoffs as well. We are really getting down to the nitty gritty, but I'd love to know you guys' thoughts on everything going on in the LCK down in the comment section below. Do you like the games? Do you like the teams? Do you think that there might be any upsets as we get into playoffs? Anybody playing above their weight or below their weight right now? Would just love to know your thoughts and opinions on everything down below. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on everything that's gone on in the LCK so far this year, you can check out the LCK playlist up in the iCard right now. That's going to have every single weekly recap in it. And so if you want to watch the first one, if you want to watch last week's, whichever in between, if you want to watch those, they're going to be up obviously in that playlist. But today, we're going to be going over week number 8, talking about everything. And if you're new here, what we do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will also be updating my personal power rankings at the end of the week from number 1 to number 10. They really haven't changed a lot over the course of this split because the LCK has been generally pretty predictable. However, we'll see if that ends up changing because there certainly are a lot of things going on right now in the LCK. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. I know we're already 2 minutes into this and we haven't even started, so I want to get right into the action, and that's going to kick off with day number 1. And of course, day number 1 was actually kicked off with a potential playoff matchup in terms of the seedings right now. Hanwha Life Esports taking on the Kwangdong Freecs. Obviously, Hanwha sitting in 3rd, KDF sitting in 6th. This could be a potential first round matchup, and predictably, Hanwha Life is going to be able to pick up the win. Credit to KDF. They actually were able to win a game in the middle here, which is kind of against the run of form that they've been on. They have been absolutely disastrous over the past couple of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks in particular, where, you know, just 4 weeks ago, a month ago, we were sitting here talking about how KDF could potentially win a playoff series, could surprise, could be the 4 or 5 seed going into the playoffs because they were white hot. It seemed they had figured something out with their new bot lane, but things have come crashing down around them, and now the question isn't, oh, are they going to make noise in the playoffs? The question is, are they going to make the playoffs? They're really the only spot that's still left up in the air. Hanwha Life continuing to look great. They have obviously done a lot of really good things. This week is not going to get easier, but this is a very good win for them, and I continue to champion this team. I think that they're better and more consistent than people are giving them credit for. Player of the series for me is pretty obviously going to go to Delight in this one. He was awesome for HLE, and I think one of the most encouraging signs for me personally in this series was who was able to get a lot of the advantages and the leads for HLE. When you're looking at this team, it's been Zeka and Viper that have really been doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of actually winning games. Delight obviously has helped in that regard, but Dora and Peanut haven't exactly been the game-breaking takeover forces that they were on Gen.G. Peanut in particular, I would have expected to be better on HLE pairing up with a mid laner like Zeka, who seems stylistically very good for him. However, that's what we got in this series. Player of the series is Delight. Peanut was also a big standout. That's not to say Zeka and Viper weren't good. They've been good all year long, and they've been very consistent, but this is the kind of performance that you want to see from those former Gen.G players. The Alistair and the Thresh in particular for HLE looked great. You know, I'm pretty anti-Thresh in terms of, you know, playing him right now in the meta. I don't think Thresh is strong. I think that basically every other engaged hook champion does something better. Even someone like a Pyke, I think, might be more consistent than Thresh at this point because of the nerfs. However, obviously so many supports have him in their wheelhouse and have played so much of him that you can still have really big pop-off performances like you did in this game and, you know, in game number 3 here in this series just in general. Delight was awesome as a playmaker and was definitely the better support in this matchup. But like I said, Peanut was also a big positive. Cuz has really not been good in recent times. He's been very feast or famine, a lot of famine coming in from Cuz, and, you know, he was really good at the beginning of the year, but Peanut took advantage of that bad form to have one of his better series in a while. I think people have been critical of Peanut, and while I don't think he's been bad, I still think he's been a top 4 jungler in the LCK. I think he's been decently consistent from game to game. He's not having these game-winning plays in the mid-game like he was on Gen.G super regularly. It's kind of been more of a facilitative role for mid and for bot lane, and obviously, he can fill that role, but we know he can be a superstar. We know he can step up even with really good talent around him while still allowing that talent to look like standout players. And it just hasn't necessarily been that for me, but this series was a great example as to what Peanut can do at his absolute best. The Lee Sin was incredible, and it's really nice to see him play a lot more aggressive in the early game when given the option. Zeka and Viper, like I said, continued to be very good. They're just going to be solid, specifically Viper, who's very consistent. Zeka, obviously not as consistent, but his peak is higher, in my opinion, in terms of the game-to-game of what you're going to get. He's won most of the games for Hanwha Life over the course of this split, and so HLE looking really good. I think this team is obviously very scary, and I would not want to run into them at any point. But for KDF, it really is panic time. You are now 3 series below 500 in terms of your series score, and that's a disaster. You've got another series coming up later this week that you need to win, but you're not playing well. There's really nothing else to say. Dead of the series is going to go to Ondil, but Bull, Doo-Doo, like, Cuz, not playing well. Bulldog didn't really do anything of note in this series. It's not really anybody's time to step up and carry this team, and that's not really what I expected. There have been players that have been good on bad teams in the past here, specifically the top side of the map, Doo-Doo and Bulldog, who were relatively good for this team last year, specifically Doo-Doo in the top lane, and he's just not having a good split. This is his worst split in 3 years, in my opinion. Cuz, I think, has taken some regression, although some of that is going to be confidence, some of that is going to be momentum. He's always been a bit of a finicky player like that, and Bull and Ondil, I think, have crashed back down to earth in terms of what they offer mechanically as a bot lane. Like I said, Ondil is done of the series. There was a massive support gap here. Horrible Nautilus game in Game 3 from Ondil. Just constantly caught out, never in the right position. He was done of the week for the entire league last week, and, you know, it's just not looking good for this KDF bot lane. It feels like they have slowly regressed into being one of the weaker ones in the league. If Bull's not going to be able to get back on track as a carry, if you can't really play through him, it clearly doesn't seem like you can play through Doo-Doo on the top side in the same way that you would be able to last year, and Cuz has been very inconsistent. This is not a particularly good team, and as much as we've said the top 6 feels kind of locked because of just how things have gone, it's certainly not, depending on how the rest of this week ends up going for other teams. And so KDF really needs to put their foot on the gas because it's starting to get concerning that they're not able to pick up wins. They were at least able to get Game 2, though. And then for HLE, great series, you know, not a lot of negatives to talk about. A lot of the tougher competition is going to come later in the week, but at least for now, they passed the test that they were supposed to. Then moving on to the second series of day 1 here, and it's a pretty classic matchup in the LCK. Dplus KIA taking on T1. And T1 predictably is going to get the 2-0, although this was not a clean series by any means from T1. This was not your standard, oh, you know, they win in the early game and then transition into a quick end. This was T1 losing in the early game, not really having any sort of pressure, and just out team fighting, out macroing in particular the enemy team, capitalizing on mistakes and being able to win both games. I say this is not standard, but this is pretty standard for T1. This is just kind of how they play the game. They're not exactly the best early game team in the entire world, especially in comparison to the teams that are around them in terms of, you know, success rate. When you're talking about Gen.G, when you're talking about Billy or JD Gaming, like those teams are more dominant in the early game, I would say, than T1, but you always kind of know that T1 is in a game because they are so good at playing the mid to late game, specifically like 20 to 28 minutes. That's like the bread and butter of T1. They're constantly finding advantages in that zone that other teams just aren't able to find nearly as easily. But for DK, you had this series on lock. You really should have won it. There's really not a lot of excuses for losing maybe the series as a whole, but like especially game 2 here. Like, how do you lose that game? And even game 1, like, how do you lose that game? You're in such a good position and you're just not able to capitalize on it. But for T1, player of the series for me is going to go to Gumayushi. It felt like he was definitely the better AD carry in this series. Shout out to KT. I very much considered giving it to him. And honestly, I think you absolutely could. I think it should go to either Guma or KT in terms of who you think had a bigger impact, but I really like the Caitlyn in Game 2, and honestly, I loved how he played Lucian in Game 1. I really think that Gumayushi is one of the better Lucians in the world. He knows how to stay aggressive in the mid game, and honestly, we see a lot of Lucians play a little bit safer in terms of, you know, maybe the types of engages they go for. They play like AD carries. Guma is going to play him like an assassin. He's going to try to take out the enemy Smolder or the enemy Karma very early on in fights, and oftentimes it's very important to do so. And I think Guma is just a really solid player. Maybe not a star, like maybe not a top 1 or top 2 ADC in the world, but I think he's top 5, or at the very least, like in that conversation. We've known that Guma is very good. He reminds me so much of Gala. I think they're very similar players in terms of how they execute on some of their strategies. They're both more stable pieces than they are like game takeover pieces, but that's really good for T1 when you have those in other spots. And occasionally you'll get a series like this where Guma does everything right and is just better than his counterpart. But like I said, KIA looking really good. A lot of people said he can't play, enchanters, he can't play engagers. He's just kind of a one trick in terms of marksman. Those people obviously had never watched KIA before because this guy was good long before he reinvented the meta, but 2 games of Nami and both of them look great. I actually really like Caitlyn Nami. It's really difficult to deal with. We saw the Lucian Sona on the other side of this matchup. I understand the idea behind that, but if you were to execute it better, then perhaps you could have won this series. The Caitlyn Nami were just more relevant as we got to the back half of the series. Of course, shout out to Faker on his Ahri. Awesome game number 2. He was probably the star of that second game, but I thought Guma and KIA were a little bit more of a standout over the course of both of the games in this series. Zeus was good on the top side. I think he could have been a little bit more consistent in the early game, but that's kind of been Zeus throughout this year up until this point. Very good team fighter, not as good on a game-to-game, laning basis. And then Owner's just been there. He's been fine. He's not been a star. He's just kind of been a part of this team, which, that's a conversation for another day. I'm actually not super impressed with how Owner has played in 2024, but T1 is a team that I am impressed with. Still have to keep expectations in check. I think that they are clearly on the outs of that top 3 in the world right now with Billy, with JD Gaming, with Gen.G, because they just have not been able to cross that finish line. But, I mean, this team won Worlds last year. Who's to say they can't get their shit in check when things actually start to matter in the playoffs? But for DK on the other side, you were so close to winning this, and honestly, you absolutely should have. Dud of the series is going to go to aiming. His positioning mistakes down the stretch of both of these games really cost them. And, I don't really know what to tell you. His aggressiveness is both his best trait and his worst trait. This guy is 3 player of the series, 3 dud of the series over the course of this year. That's got to be the most of anybody in the LCK, or at the very least up there with anybody in the LCK for the kind of variance that you could possibly see. Aiming is just one of those guys where if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. He's going to step up on Lucian, as we talked about with Guma, but instead of it being calculated and, going for the backliners, he's going to try to 1v9 you, and oftentimes that champion's just going to get caught out. Specifically, if you're not really warding across the map, you're going to be put in bad positions, and your team fighting's not going to be as consistent as maybe like a Smolder would. And so, aiming, I think, really suffered in terms of that game number 2, was not great. Kellen, I don't think necessarily helped, although I don't know how much you can do with Milio and Sona in that particular circumstance. There was just not going to be a lot of peel in that instance, and aiming was playing way too aggro. Showmaker continued to look really good. I know his scoreline doesn't look great, but he was playing Annie in game 2 and Karma in game 1. These aren't takeover plays or takeover champions. I don't really know why you're putting him on these champions that are much more for setting up someone else. I think Showmaker needs to be the primary carry on this team in every single series that they play. That's all that they have proven to me over the course of this year, but, it was the decision they wanted to go with. Lucid's still struggling, but I think this was actually a more positive series than he has had recently. Owner is not the worst at establishing early pressure, and I think Lucid did a great job to match that, but DK just wasn't talented enough to be able to take the leads that they were able to generate in the early and the mid game and translate them into the late game. Too many mistakes, too many costly errors, bad macro. It just kind of led into a loss. They're a good team, but they're not a great team, and I think we saw that here in T1. They are a great team. Are they an elite team? Are they one of the best in the world? That is to be determined. They haven't necessarily done anything to prove that to me over the course of this year, but obviously this team's won Worlds. You have to imagine they're going to get back into that spot. I'm not trying to sit here and count out T1, just offering up some mild criticism for a team that should be winning a lot harder than they did here. And then moving on now to day number 2 here in week 8, and we kick day 2 off with actually a surprisingly important match considering how things are going. FearX taking on DRX. And FearX is going to pick up the win. The X teams going up against each other, and Fox is going to be able to get the 2-0 win very dominantly. They were definitely the better team in this series, and this isn't a big upset. This is not a particularly surprising outcome when it comes to how FearX has been playing. They've gone on this gigantic losing streak. I think they've lost like 10 series in a row, but you have to look at the teams they played in those 10 series. It's basically exclusively teams that are going to be guaranteed in the playoffs. Their schedule worked out in a very weird way where they got all their easiest games at the beginning and the end of the split in this double round robin, but luckily for them, they're actually getting into the easiest part of their schedule. They're starting to play the bottom tier teams, and obviously things still need to go right. You have to hope that your confidence isn't completely smashed by the fact that you've been playing good teams and losing a lot over the last couple of weeks, but this was a good sign and a good series to show that they are still consistently better than the bottom 3. But for DRX, this is a bad team, and they don't really have a lot going for them. They've been getting better in recent weeks. I think that's definitely true with Yehu coming in and, just more stability coming in around the roster, but they're still not good. Bottom 3 is still very much bottom 3, as we saw here. But for Fox, player of the series, I'm actually going to give it to Execute. I think you could give this to Clear in the top lane. It should definitely be one of these two. Clear absolutely gapped Rascal, who we will get into. Had a miserable series. Bad laning, no pressure in teamfights, just looked completely checked out. His mechanics were not good. Just not a good performance coming in from a top laner that people continue to try and defend to an extent, although I think people are catching up to where I've been for the past year and a half now. But Execute was, very good, exceptional in this series on the Rel. That's why he's going to get player of the series for me. I've been very critical of Execute because I had high expectations for him coming into this year. He was so good in the LEC for Astralis that you really thought that he was going to be able to translate some of that pressure to a team that does want to play a bit more aggro than maybe Astralis was playing last year. And I really do like his mechanics, and, he's a very talented player. However, it's just not necessarily worked out in a bot lane that I don't think has been particularly strong with Hanwha, who's, again, not a great bot laner. And I think that's definitely caused a bit of problems, but when you put him on an engaged tank that can really take over the game and you put him against a team that he is definitely better and more talented than, you still are going to get great performances like this. This doesn't erase my thoughts and opinions on how he has played over the course of this year, but it does show that it is still there. And like I said, when you have someone like Clear who's also winning on the top side, you have a Rel that's moving around the map, creating opportunities for basically everyone else, for Hanwha and Closer and Willard to be able to take over in fights. That's a recipe for success. I think you rely a lot on what Execute does for this team to actually make them relevant. They've had a very good support in Kale for the last couple of years, and I think, Execute hasn't come in and necessarily been that for this team, but this was a good series to show that at least against the opposition they should be beating, he can be that. But Closer was also pretty good here. Tristana, Ahri, Yehu's been all right, definitely been better than Satab in the mid lane for DRX, but Closer is just a more talented player, even if I'm not the biggest fan of him, even if I think he has proven that he's not going to be a star. Hanwha was fine, didn't really make any mistakes, but Execute was the one creating a lot of action for him, just needed to kind of play his role, and he did that. Willard continues to be really aggro in the mid game, and that's going to get him into trouble in a lot of different circumstances, but when you're going into Sponge, who has been a negative just generally throughout this year, you're going to be able to win that, and then obviously, like I said, Clear was good. And so Fox basically across the board end up winning this, and again, this is a good sign that potentially moving into the easier part of their schedule in the back half, they could actually make a playoff race relatively interesting, especially with their series later this week. But for DRX, they're just bad. Like, bottom 3 is bad, and DRX is in that bottom 3. No matter the kinds of advancements that they've been making, they're just not good enough to actually be able to compete with a team with any sort of talent. They clearly are mentally checked out. Rascal's done of the series, 0-3-0, didn't participate in a single kill the entire series, and that's not even necessarily the full story. If you go and watch this laning phase that he had on Renekton or on Cassante in Game 2, it's just a disaster. This guy has completely either lost the ability to play League of Legends, or he's just so mentally checked out that it doesn't matter anymore. He has been one of the worst players, if not the worst player in the LCK over the course of this year, and I was making that argument last year for him as well when everybody was defending him. It's just not good. Honestly, if I'm DRX, you have to move in a different direction going into summer. I just don't see any reason to stick around with Rascal if he's going to be mentally checked out in the way that he is. But it's not like the rest of the team played well. Sponge got destroyed in the jungle matchup again, as he has done relatively regularly this entire year. Yehu, I think, has made him better. Those two play off each other better than him and Satab did earlier on in the year, but it doesn't really matter. Like, Sponge is just not talented enough in order to keep up with junglers like Willer, who do have a lot going for them. Yehu, Plata, like, they are good players, and they are generally players that I'm looking forward to in the future, but they played horrible in this series. They didn't have a lot going for them. Plata in particular, somebody who I've gushed about on this channel, who I think is by far the best player on DRX. He was not particularly great here, and it's going to happen. Execute was just better. Teddy is fine. Again, the definition of, like, don't pick Smolder is DRX here, where, yes, that champion's very strong, and yes, it can carry games, but you're never going to get Teddy into a situation where he's going to be able to pop off in the same way that you would other AD carries, because he just doesn't have the mentality to get a ton of resources in the same way, like, quickly as other ADCs will, and you're just going to lose out on the pressure fight, and we saw that here. Generally, DRX is just bad. They're not particularly good. Maybe they're still the best of the worst teams in the league. Again, bottom 3 is such a shit show in the LCK that DRX might actually be the highest upside of them, but this was a good example of why bottom 3 are in their own tier. And then for Fox, again, they're not out of the playoffs by any means. Their series later this week is actually going to matter a lot for a lot of different things. Their schedule's pretty easy down the stretch. They're playing basically the easiest teams left in the league. They don't have any top 5 opponents left in the LCK, and so you could see a potential big winning streak coming in from Fox, and especially with the way KDF is playing, playoffs are definitely within reach for them. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2 here, a top team versus bottom team clash that went as per usual, as expected, kind of. Okay, BRION taking on KT Rolster, and yes, this was a KT 2-0 win, and you're happy to see that, and I do think they looked good throughout this series. However, they made it a lot closer than it needed to be in that second game. Bro, to their credit, does kind of fight back and make things relatively interesting in a lot of the series that they end up losing. However, they're just not talented enough to actually be able to keep up with any team with real expectations. Their, late games are really bad, even if their mid games are pretty okay, and so you end up getting these situations where they just fall off super hard by the end, and that's what we got here. Credit to KT, though. They actually had a lot of good going for them in this series up until the end. I think a lot of people are going to want to see somebody else get player of the series, but it's hard for me to overlook Pioshik, the jungler for KT, who is going to get it for me. He is going to be the player of the series because he got a pentakill on the Kindred, and it's not the only reason, but he really did take over in that first game. Finally, his first ever career pentakill on his signature champion. That is obviously a big positive for him, but he has been the driving force for every offensive play that KT has made throughout this year so far. When you're talking about a team that has really struggled to find any sort of consistency with your mid laner not playing nearly as well as they did last year in BDD, with your bot lane being very feast or famine, even if I like how Deft has played for the most part. Perfect, obviously not exactly being great from a game-to-game basis, having good upside, and he's gotten better as the year has gone along, but certainly not the most consistent top laner in the world. You're relying a lot on this big game breaker in Pioshik to actually step up, and I think it's very fair to say that this is clearly his best regular season ever. You can talk about the peak of Pioshik being whatever you want. Obviously, winning Worlds is a pretty high peak, but in terms of performance, maybe you can talk about the 2021 DRX team that he basically dragged to the number 4 seed in the LCK. But for me, in terms of takeover performances, I can't remember a split where Pioshik has shown so many good things rather than spring of 2024 right now. And so that's a really big positive. Obviously, still going to have some bad moments like he did on the Lee Sin in that game number 2. Not always in the right position, not always creating positive plays for the rest of the team. However, as long as you're getting mostly good plays from him, and especially if he's going to just straight up win you one of the games in the series, that's important enough for me to consider him your most valuable player on KT at the moment. But Deft is also, of course, very valuable. The Senna, in particular, in Game 2, was a really good showing. I think Senna Ornn has performed very poorly over the course of this year in every region that it's been played in. It's just not a bot lane that has necessarily worked, even though in theory, I can definitely understand why it's such a positive, but we saw the advantages of it in game number 2 because the Senna just became so strong. You get that Ornn item, you get Senna infinitely scaling into a 40-minute game, and it's just very difficult to end up dealing with, even when you're playing Smolder. And again, we've talked about this, Smolder is not unbeatable. We're actually seeing it lose quite a lot here in the LCK, and it's not just the LCK. We talked about it in the LPL, and the NACL, and the LCS. Smolder's losing everywhere. Let's not pretend like this champion is just unbeatable. This is the kind of way to beat it. Senna just outscaled him and honestly just did way more damage in the back half, so credit to Deft. I thought BDD was actually fine in this series, one of his more consistent ones in a while. Certainly wasn't a star, but as a facilitator, he actually played a lot of these fights very well, specifically on the Karma in Game 1, so you're going to be happy with that. Perfect and Beryl were fine. Perfect, I think, had a good series. Beryl was okay, had a couple of good moments. I don't think they were stars by any means, and perhaps them getting more consistent could have led to an easier win here, but credit to Pioshik and Deft to an extent, and BDD to a smaller extent to keep KT on track here and get them the win they needed. And then for Bro, they're just not good. Even though they kept game 2 close, they just don't know how to close games. This team isn't talented enough. I can only say so much about the bottom 3 teams that I'm not repeating myself, right? These bottom 3 teams don't actually have a core identity. They don't have a core way to play the game. And it's very clear that they just fall apart when, good teams, even playing bad games, end up, competing with that. And Gideon's going to get out of the series, but I think you could give this to Karis for game 1 on the Corki. Why are you picking Corki into Karma in this particular team comp with a Lee Sin and a Senna and a Renekton? This just feels like a complete lack of synergy, in my opinion, in terms of how to play. And Karis is also not a carry. He's not very good. And putting a lot of responsibility on him, I think, was bad in Game 1. But Gideon was probably worse in Game 2 on the Rel. There were some good creation moments. I do think that some of the engages were fine. And, honestly, it wasn't that bad of a game. Generally, I think Bro was fine. But compounding that with the Lee Sin in Game 1, which I think also was not very good, I think is also just enough for me to give him dud of the series, if you will. But there's really no one I can look at on this Bro team and feel confident about. Polu has been one of the worst supports in the league, especially ever since Samver left. Him and Envy do not have any chemistry, even if Envy is playing better. You're getting better performances out of the AD carry now that the meta, I think, has moved into something that he's more comfortable with, not having to be as aggressive in the early game, getting to play things like Smolder. I think that's definitely more of a comfort zone, but he's still not even close to the best Smolder in the league. Karis is not winning in the mid lane. Morgan's been fine. He's had a couple of really good games. Basically, a lot of their wins wins have come off of him, just as they have in previous years, but he's not a star in the top lane or anything. He's not going to win every series, even if he was, partially better than perfect in this series. But, Gideon, I think, has really fallen off since the beginning of this split. There's just not a lot of good to talk about with Bro, and that means I don't want to spend too much time on them. They're fine, but KT is actually genuinely an interesting team. Are they going to be able to step it up when playoffs come around? This is kind of an organ, especially a collection of players that has gotten better when they're locked in, and when games matter more, they're very inconsistent. Pyosik, Deft, Barrel, you really don't know what you're going to get from them on a game-to-game basis, but they have the upside to potentially beat almost anybody in the world, and so you do have to look out for them, but that inconsistency isn't going to stop me from at least worrying a bit. Then moving on now to day number 3, our middle day here in the LCK in week number 8, and we kicked off day 3 with number 1 versus number 10 in my power rankings, Gen.G taking on NS RedForce, and Gen.G does get the job done. This was close, as NS series tend to be over the course of this year, but because their macro is so bad, because they have absolutely no idea what to do in the late game, they end up losing games that they are ahead in, and that's just kind of the story of NS split. Up until this point, they just can't win games, even if they do look good in these games. We will talk about them a bit more later, because in every post-match thread you're seeing, NS good, perhaps, they're clearly better than the bottom teams. Well, if they were clearly better than the bottom teams, they would be beating the bottom teams, but they're just not, because they played this way. They played these exact series against both Gen.G and, Bro and DRX, and so it just kind of is what it is. But for Gen.G, you are at least able to get out of here with the win. Mid-jungle's just popping off. Like, there's really not a lot else to say when it comes to Gen.G. Right now, those two are just clicking on every single cylinder. I would argue that Canyon and Chovy have the upside to be even better than what Canyon and Showmaker were, even in their prime. Not saying that that is definitely going to happen, but it certainly is something that has the potential to be true. Chovy completely popped off on the Kassadin in Game 1. We've basically seen none of this champion over the course of 2024 in any major region, but if anybody's gonna pull it out and just dominate on it, get super far ahead and, get Call Me out of the lineup because he beat him so bad, it's going to be Chovy. And then to go from Kassadin, who's a big resource carry, wants to carry a lot of damage, into a really good game of Taliyah, that was exceptional as well. But for me, player of the series is going to go to Canyon in the jungle. I think he has been exceptional over the past few weeks. Of course, Chovy is an MVP frontrunner for basically everybody, but Canyon's right up there for me as like a first-team All-Pro potential kind of guy. It's going to be probably either him or Pyosik in terms of who I end up going with in the jungle spot for first-team All-Pro, but Canyon's certainly making a strong, argument, I would say, in series like this. Maybe he's not the most dominant player in the world, but you watch the mechanics, you watch the execution of the plays that he's able to make, and you're like, golly, this guy can win any game at any given time. It's really good stuff, and obviously the way he plays off of mid lane has been very positive, but Canyon continuing to look awesome. Both him and Showmaker, I do think, are looking better than they did last year individually. I already liked what Showmaker was doing last year for DK, but now I think both of them are even looking better, but Chovy is still amazing. I'm not trying to take anything away from Chovy, obviously. There was a gigantic mid gap in both of these games, basically. No matter who NS played in the mid lane, Chovy was going to absolutely demolish them. Not only in terms of 1v1 potential, but like, look at the pressure. Just the ability for Chovy to always be ahead, for him to be playing Taliyah, be up 50 CS and be moving around the map and just absolutely dominating. There's just no other mid laner in the world that is doing this right now. As much as I love Knight, and as much as I go to bat for Knight, I think Chovy is clearly the best player in the world right now, and that is a tough thing to, say, because people just continuously push back on his inability to win international tournaments and talk about how, oh, he hasn't won Worlds, he hasn't won MSI, that means he can't be the best player in the world. I disagree, man. Performance and eye test and, production, that's what matters to me, and Chovy is just kind of the king of that. He has been the best player in the LCK for the past, 3 years. Obviously, you've had single performances that have been a bit better, but over the course of that time, I can't think of anybody who's been more consistent, and now he's even better with Canyon in here than he was with Peanut. It's terrifying. Keen continues to look awesome on the top side here. Pretty strong case that he has been the best top laner in the LCK. I mean, it's him and Zeus that are going to be fighting it out for that award. But the thing that it's impressed me the most about Keen is that it doesn't really matter the resources that he gets. He's just so useful all the time, even in lane, and you're just not getting that all that consistently with other top laners. Like, obviously, people are like, oh, I'm so happy to see Canyon on Lee Sin and not on tanks. Get him off tank duty, but also get Keen off of tank duty, and also put Lahens on playmakers, and it's like, well, these guys are going to have to play tanks. Like, sitting here and saying that getting Canyon off of tank duty is going to make this team better is ridiculous. Some games he's going to be better on tanks because it's going to allow the other superstars on this team to pop off. But some games, you know, you get to carry with Canyon, and Keen gets to play weak side, and sometimes you play against an opponent that you can ego check a bit more in draft, and you pick Tom Kench in the bot lane with Senna, and you're playing Rumble alongside the Lee Sin and the Kassadin, and you get these really dominant games. And, you know, generally, I think that only comes with the fact that talent level on this team is so high, and they can get away with basically anything. Pays and Lahens were also good, but this was really mid-jungle destroying, and Keen also having a great series in the top lane. And then for Nongshim, again, there's going to be a lot of people that are always talking about how competitive Nongshim is in these games, and yes, they lose a lot less hard than like Bro and DRX do, the other bottom 3 teams. But the problem is they don't have the upside. Their macro is so bad in the back half that even if they are in good positions, even if they are able to win some 4v4s against Gen.G because they're talented, they can't do anything with them. They're never able to close out games. They're never able to actually stabilize a lead. And it's become such a problem that, to me, they're the least likely team in the entire league to win a game or to win a series, and it's just the inconsistency there. Mid lane obviously has a lot to do with that. You know, Fiesta's getting dead of the series because I think the Ahri game was really bad in game 3, but you want to give this to both Call Me and Fiesta? Like, this is a mid-gap award that I'm giving out here. Dead of the series goes to the mid lane for Nongshim. It goes to both players who ended up losing really hard in those circumstances. Din Din got destroyed in the top lane. I'm tired of this vein. It's just not working out at the LCK level. You have to be better than the person you're playing into in order to pull that off, and Din Din is just not going to be that as one of the weaker top laners in the league. And even if Jiwoo and Peter are great, and yes, they played really well in this series, again on the Kalista Renata, they continue to be the bright spot. Sylvie, I think, had a couple of good engages on the Rel. It's just not enough. The talent level of this team is too low, and specifically because solo lanes are very important, mid lane is very important, and they just have the worst mid lane room in the entire league right now, which means that it's just going to be a lot harder to win games. So even if they are keeping up in terms of the early and the mid game and actually winning fights as we get later into like 20-25 minutes, none of it really matters, and they're never really able to transition that into wins, and that really at the end of the day is the only stat that matters. And so, you know, for Nongshim, they're fine. Again, they're a part of the bottom 3. I've said so much about them, but Gen.G is the best team in the league. This is the kind of 2-0 that you would expect. Maybe you wanted it to be more dominant, but this is what I thought the series was going to be going into it, and it kind of played out exactly as it was. So many players on Gen.G are playing some of the best league they've played in a while, and that's a very encouraging sign. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and this was the series of the week for me and for a lot of people on paper. And man, did we get a result that I was not expecting. T1 taking on Hanwha Life Esports, and HLE picks up a ginormous win here to take down one of the 2 big behemoths in the LCK. It very much has felt like a top 2 all year long. Everybody has spoken about it, me included, as a top 2 all year long, as there have been 2 best teams. Gen.G has beaten T1 twice, and they are clearly at 1 right now, but T1 clearly better than the rest of the league. But here, Hanwha Life are pushing themselves into that conversation. They've been the clear-cut number 3 best team in the league, but who's to say this couldn't be a finals team if everything ended up going right for them, if they locked in at the right time? I think what gives them so much confidence and what lets them play so well in series like this is just how well-rounded they are, not only as a team because all of their positions are relatively strong, but because all of the players on this team are very well-rounded. Maybe with the exception of Zeka, who, I get it, people talk about his his small champion pool. I would counter-argument with, I don't think it's a small champion pool. I think it's a small champion style pool, if that makes sense. Like, he can play every aggressive assassin in the game at a very high level, but he's not going to be as good when he has to play a little bit slower, and that's kind of always been Zeka. But Doran, Peanut, Viper, Delight, they're kind of very variable and kind of hard to deal with because they can play so many different styles, and I think T1 ended up falling to that here. We'll talk about them in a bit, but let's talk about what Hanwha did well in this series. And player of the series for me is going to go to Zeka. I think Peanut was also very good here, and to me, it was very much up for debate whether I wanted to give this to Peanut or Zeka, because I do think both of them really deserved it, especially for their wins. But Zeka was a bit better in their loss, and that's why I'm actually going to give it to him. Obviously, the Talia game in Game 3 is what's really going to stand out. He took over the map, had a very Faker-esque performance, and I know a lot of people talk about how Zeka's champion pool is minuscule, but he just destroyed Faker on Talia, so I don't know what we're doing anymore, man. He's been really good on a couple of these picks. He's had the single best Orianna game of the year a couple of weeks ago, and so we know he can play these, like, more traditionally control, like, late game macro style mages like Talia, like Orianna, that have been very popular in the meta. We know he can play them at a high level. And that just makes him even scarier. This guy has been one of the most valuable players in the entire league so far this year. It reminds me a lot of that 2022 DRX run where people were just counting out how important he was towards his team's wins. People were giving a lot of credit to Deft and Beryl and Pioshik, and while they did deserve a good bit of it, specifically Pioshik, who in their wins was very good, Zeka was the carry of that team, and I think a very similar thing is happening here with Hanwha because of the perception and the conversation surrounding Zeka. He has been super good on everything that he has been asked to play, maybe with the exception of Corki. But, you know, he's not the worst Corki in the league. He's just worse than his contemporaries at Corki, which is fine. You can live with that. It's not exactly a champion that I would really want to see Hanwha Life continue to pull out. But look at this amazing Taliyah game. He'll have games like this every so often that remind you that, yeah, he prefers his style, but he can do a little bit of everything, and he has been phenomenal for Hanwha Life. Definitely an MVP contender for me. And then, obviously, Peanut was incredible here, specifically on the Poppy in Game 1. It feels like every time he plays this champion, he pops off. Pun entirely intended. You know, I talk about it all the time on this channel, but he really is like the innovator of Poppy Jungle. Not to say he was the first person ever to play it, because it's been around for many years, but when you look back at like 2022, 2021, Peanut was the one that was playing it in pro before anybody else was picking it up. He was spamming it in the regular season that first year that Gen.G was really popping off, and it was a big reason why Gen.G was so successful, as he was very good at that champion. Everybody followed suit, started playing Poppy in pro, and it's kind of been a staple ever since, and Peanut is still the best at it. He's still the best Poppy jungle in the world, in my opinion. We saw that in Game 1. The Maokai in Game 3 was really good, but again, more of a facilitative style, allowing players like Zeka to be able to pop off. I think he's getting back to being one of the better facilitators in the league. Could be an all-pro candidate, if only because jungle's been pretty weak in the LCK this split, but was definitely better than Owner in this series. Viper and Delight were solid, definitely a continuation of what they've been doing. Doran, while he wasn't perfect in this series, the Jace wasn't exactly ideal, and the Cassante was really bad in Game 2. It was certainly enough to be able to win some fights, and especially with Zeus on Aatrox, you knew they were going to be cursed going up against Doran, but Zeka and Peanut, in my opinion, the two biggest standouts here for HLE. And for T1, you know, this was an okay series in the sense that Game 2 was pretty good. Faker played really well in Game 2, and I think you can talk about Zeus not having that bad of a series overall, even if he is a bit cursed on Aatrox against Doran, but the other pieces really concern me, especially with how they played in the back half here. Dead of the series is going to go to Owner. I'm pretty concerned about Owner, and I've said for a while I don't think he would be a top-tier jungler if he wasn't playing on T1 with Faker. We saw that a bit last year when Poby came in the mid lane, and Owner was the one who really completely fell off, was really bad during that stretch. He was a lot better during Worlds, and once Faker came back in, it felt like his confidence was reinvigorated, but he was the only player on this team that I did not give an A grade going into the split. I gave him a B+ grade, and that's because I do think he is the weakest of these players, and honestly, that grade is going down for me as we continue on this year. I don't think he's had a particularly good year. I think a lot of his mistakes are being masked by the fact that mid lane is constantly winning and constantly in an advantage state. So when you get a series like this where Zeka actually does have a lot of prio in mid and Faker can't just dominate the matchup in the same way that he's been able to do against other teams, Owner is the one who looks more out of place because a lot of his positive and successful plays over the course of this split, I think, have relied a lot on Faker being as good as he is. And I think Owner's really starting to get exposed. This has been some of the worst league that he has played in a little while. I think KT was miserable down the stretch in this series on the Nautilus. He was pretty okay at the beginning, and obviously pulling out things like the Nico in Game 2 are positive, but the Nautilus game in Game 3 was not good. Gumayushi's positioning on Zeri continues to be a bit of a problem. This was kind of a conversation when Zeri was really broken, that he actually wasn't great on Zeri, and this team generally would move into different directions rather than play the meta of Zeri in those times. And, you know, Guma's always been a bit better on champions that are more lane-oriented, that allow KT to be a little bit more of the dominant presence in the mid-game or the late game, and Zeri just doesn't necessarily fit that style. Still, you need to see the positioning be a bit better. I talked about how consistent he was. This was not a consistently good performance, but again, Faker was good in Game 2 on the Taliyah. Could have been a bit better in Game 1 and Games 1 and 3, but I think that has more to do with Zeka being very good rather than Faker being bad, and Zeus was fine, but Owner is concerning me. KT has been feast or famine in their losses, and Guma's just not going to be able to play these hyper carries. There are real problems with T1. You would still expect this to be a top 2 team. I'm not sitting here and saying Hanwha definitely would beat T1 in a best of 5 because of this best of 3, but I certainly think it's a lot closer than I was anticipating before going into this week, and for HLE, that is a good thing because this team is legit and for real. I'm really excited to see what they can do. Remember, there are 2 MSI spots coming out for the LCK for all of the major regions, and who's to say HLE couldn't grab one of those and make the finals and actually go on a run? They're certainly talented enough to do so, and I think people are finally starting to give some of these players the credit they deserve. And then moving on to day number 4 now here in the LCK, and we actually get a very important series that wouldn't necessarily seem like it on paper. FearX taking on the Kwangdong Freecs. And FearX actually is able to pick up this win, and this creates a super interesting scenario and situation, because now FearX is only 1 game behind KDF going into the final week of the season for that final playoff spot. And you might be thinking, well, all KDF has to do is win 1 game, right? That's really the only situation that they need to avoid. But KDF's final week is certainly not easy, especially in comparison to FearX, who have 2 of the weakest teams in the entire league in the final week of the season. This has all of a sudden become a pretty interesting conversation for who might be able to pull out that 6th seed spot, and that is disaster for Kwangdong, because they have been clear-cut the 6th best team in the league. It almost felt like no matter how bad they played, no matter how much Bro ended up breaking them in that 1 week where they lost to them twice, none of that mattered because too many teams were just too far out of it. The bottom tier teams in the league were just not good enough to be able to keep up, but FearX with this win actually make this conversation significantly more interesting and certainly raise the stakes for next week entirely. Player of the series for me in this one is going to go to Clear in the top lane. He had a really good week. He kind of just won both of his top lane matchups. And honestly, this one was more impressive because you talk about the DRX win and it's like Rascal completely shit the bed and Clear was just straight up better than him, and you can kind of live with that. But Dudu's not only a good player, he played really well in this series. He was super active on the Renekton in Game 1, was the only player trying to keep this series alive in Games 2 and 3, was the only one on KDF that really showed up at all today. And you had Clear actually going out and keeping pace and keeping up and at times being more relevant than him like he was in that first game on Twisted Fate. I've actually been really impressed with Clear over the second half. I really did not think he had a good start to the year and was playing really inconsistent, and he still has these weeks where he just doesn't look very good. But when he's given an opportunity to actually win some games and be, on the same level as some of the other players that he's playing against, not going up against, Keen every single game or Zeus every single game, Clear actually is able to survive and look relatively good. I'm still not sold on him being a top-tier top laner like he was kind of predicted to be at some point in his career. However, I do think he actually had a phenomenal week here for Fox, and especially when they needed it most, now that they're getting into the easier part of their schedule, for him to step up and actually be winning them games, I think that's very big. Big credit to Execute. This team has looked significantly better when he is on Engaged Champions. Not to say that he's looked perfect on Engaged Champions throughout this year. I think people are like, oh, he looks way better now that he's on Engaged Champions, forgetting the fact that most of the split he's played Engaged Champions. It's just, now it's like starting to work. I'm glad he's playing better, and I'm glad that, like I said earlier in the week, like worse competition ends up making him look a tad bit better, but I still have question marks. Henna, again, more so capitalizing on the things that Execute and Willer end up creating in this series rather than creating any sort of advantages himself, but still actually able to capitalize on those on the Varus, which is a positive. Closer was fine. Certainly wasn't exceptional. The scoreline's a bit better than I think he ended up playing, and Willer was actually very influential, especially in the final game of this series on the Xinjiao. I thought it was a very, very good game from him, and he's the reason they end up winning that 3rd game, but he was also really bad in Game 2 and Game 1 on the Jax. I just didn't think it necessarily worked, and so he's not going to get Player of the Series, but overall, you've got to be excited for Fox. They actually have a real shot to be able to make playoffs, and, after going on a 10-series lose streak, that actually felt pretty impossible at times, and so to see them beat KDF, to see them put themselves in that conversation, I think is a really big positive. And then for KDF, it is like worst case scenario right now. You have gone on this gigantic losing streak. You really have only needed to win 1 of these final few series, and you've not been able to do that. Now you've set yourself up to be in a really scary position. You don't have a particularly easy schedule next week. We'll talk about that at the end of the video, but you played bad in this series, and honestly, you've continued to play bad. Done of the series is going to go to Bull in the bot lane. Again, I know a scoreline looks relatively okay, but almost all of that came in Game 1 on the MF. Games 2 and 3 were just not good. Game 3 on the Kalista was horrible from him, and I don't want to say single-handedly lost them that 3rd final game, but like Nico dominated this Kalista. It was never particularly relevant. Henna got super online, and Clear was basically able to do whatever he wanted. Willer was everywhere on the map. Like, Bull was just taken advantage of in this series, and this bot lane has like very quickly become one of the worst in the LCK again. I still think it's an upgrade over Taiyun, just because I do think he was that bad in lane, was losing so much harder than this, wouldn't even have the good game 1s that Bull is having right now, but this is kind of the natural progression that I think we were all worried was going to happen to this bot lane. Bull was not great in the Challengers League. He was a below average AD carry, honestly, at that level. And even though he's better than his player that he's replacing, he's still not going to be good at this level. And Ondo has definitely crashed back down to earth as well. He almost got dud of the series once again for me here. I think that would have been like 4 in a row for Ondo for KDF. It would have been something disastrous. But, there are real concerns with whether or not he can be an LCK caliber support. Cuz is playing bad. Dudu was awesome in this series and did his absolute best to 1v9, but honestly, this team right now is giving me shades of the summer version of themselves from last year, and that's a really bad thing to end up saying, because the summer version of that team absolutely collapsed down the stretch. They finished in last in the LCK, and so with Dudu being the only one to even remotely play well, and even him not playing well every single game, there's a real concern that this team is now going to miss playoffs, and again, their schedule's hard. It's not going to be an easy challenge. If they can win one more series, they're going to be in, but they're going to have to do that. And then for Fox, again, they've set themselves up into a really good spot. A lot of it's been luck with KDF just completely collapsing down the stretch, but they've done what they've needed to do. They've taken care of the worst teams. As long as they can do that again next week with their easier schedule, we could be looking at a playoff team for Fox in 2024. Then moving on to our second series of day number 4 here, and another one that is kind of important in terms of storylines, maybe not so much in terms of actual, effects on the league. KT Rolster taking on DRX. It's always fun to see, the KT DRX team that has kind of been put together with Pioshik, Deft, and Beryl facing off against actual DRX, even if none of those players are still on that roster from that winning year. It's still kind of a fun thing to talk about, to see the former org versus the former players, and KT is going to get the better of this situation here with a 2-1 win, although they made it a lot closer than it needed to be. Rascal was subbed out for game number 1. Frog ended up playing that first game on Renekton, was so bad against Perfect that they felt like they had to go back to Rascal, and that actually reinvigorated Rascal. We'll get into that in a second. He was the best player in game 2, even if he was miserably bad in game 3. We'll talk about the draft because, seriously, I don't understand. But for KT on the other side, this was actually one of the more consistent series that they played in a little while, even if that's kind of telling in its own right, that the fact that this was one of their more consistent series and they got absolutely obliterated by Rascal's Gnar in game number 2. Player of the series for me, maybe shockingly, is going to go to BDD in the mid lane. I've been very critical of BDD. I've seen a lot of people talk about how stable he's been in the mid lane with how volatile the rest of the KT Rolster roster is, but I honestly think he's been bad, if not worse than everybody else on this team. I think he has been the weakest member of KT in 2024 so far. You can call that stability. To me, I just call that losing by 30 CS and not really doing a whole ton in games. And yeah, he's maybe not losing as hard as the worst mid laners in the league, but he's certainly not been a positive for this team, in my opinion. They certainly have not been able to play through him. He's not been a great facilitator for the rest of them. I think he's just kind of been not good, especially in comparison to his career norms over the course of this split, but this was, in my opinion, clearly the best series that he has played. His game 1 on Annie was solid, but his game 3 on Syndra was really good, and honestly, he was the only player even trying in game 2 on the Orianna. This was just a good performance overall, in my opinion, from BDD, even if I don't think he's necessarily had the best split in the entire world, but Beryl also deserves a big shout out. Honestly, if you want to give player of the series to Beryl, I totally understand. That's another player that I think has actually exceeded my expectations over the course of this year. I've been very harsh on Beryl in previous years. 2022 and 2023 come to mind as splits that I gave Beryl one of my lowest grades in terms of all of the supports in the LCK. Like, he was bottom 2 in both of those years. He just picked things up at Worlds in 2022, in my opinion, and, that's obviously great. He's obviously somebody that cares more about the big games, clearly has mental lapses in games he doesn't care about, but he was really good in this series. The Nico in game 3 was phenomenal, and honestly, that performance alone almost got him player of the series. I just thought BDD was better across the entirety of it. Pioshik was fine, Deft was fine, Perfect was fine, after the second game, I should say, on the Camille, but this was a pretty classic KT performance. This is a team that isn't consistent, that isn't going to be great game to game, but you're going to get enough good performances out of enough players on the team for you to be able to beat a bad team like DRX that doesn't have the talent to be able to go head-to-head with you, and also drafted whatever the hell they drafted in game 3. We can talk about that now. Quinn, Lee Sin, Talia, and then Hui, Varus, bot. Like, I get the idea behind it. Hui, I think, is a very good bot laner. I think he's somebody that is very underrated in that role right now. We're seeing kind of Twisted Fate be moved around the map, top lane, mid lane, bot lane. I think Hui is a better bot laner than TF is. I've talked about how TF is much better in a solo lane and a side lane than he is as an ADC, because you're taking away one of the primary win conditions for a TF, which is the 1-3-1, the 3 part of the 1-3-1, but Hui, I think, functions really well within the concept of a team if you're running like an AD mid laner, but Talia Hui doesn't exactly inspire a lot of damage confidence from the rest of the map, and you're kind of trying to get that from Playta here with the Varus, but I just don't like the idea. You're going to be so low resource that you're really not going to be able to keep up with the Kalista, and even really the Nico on the other side of this matchup in terms of damage and productivity in the later half of this game. Someone like Keria could be able to pull this off, because Keria is such a good team fighter that you can get away with it, but DRX is not the kind of team that can enable that or play around that in a very positive way, and we saw that here. Sponge is going to get my dead of the series, though. He's just not good. Like, he loses really consistently. Again, he he has looked, I guess, a bit better maybe since Yehu came in, but it's really not been significantly better. Rascal was very good in game 2 after replacing Frog. You know, I would just stick it out with Frog, even though you're losing with him, even though he's not very good. At least you kind of get an idea of what he's going to be. I doubt that you're running Rascal in the summer split, but Rascal was miserable on the Quinn in game 3, got massacred by Perfect in lane, and Pioshik really took advantage of that as well. Syndra took advantage of that, BDD did on the other side. You know, Teddy, I think, was also in the running for Dead of the Series because of that Hwei game in game 3. Again, I think this champion is playable. I think he's actually relatively strong in the bot lane. I just think that, you know, Teddy didn't play him well, and he's never really been a great AP bot lane player. You know, Ziggs is always something that he's continuously pulled out and tried to play, and I don't think it's ever been as good as some of his other champions. And so, you know, I'm not shocked that DRX ended up dropping here. They're 3-13. They're officially out of the playoff running. Everybody in the bottom 3 is out of the playoff running, but, you know, they're fine. Again, they're maybe the best of the rest, if only because they have some interesting pieces, but, you know, it's more going to be about the changes that they make going into summer rather than the rest of the spring. But for KT, this is a good win. You're at 10 wins now. Double-digit wins is obviously very good. I'm still not sold that this is a complete team. Obviously, them and DK are going to be fighting it out for that number 4 spot. In my eyes, top 3 feels pretty locked in at the moment. KT could absolutely grab that on any given day. It's all just going to be about which version of them shows up. We've seen in this series the inconsistencies, but hopefully you can get better performances out of your more stable members. And that's going to bring us to our 5th and final day of action here in week number 8 of the LCK, and we get to end off our week, at least the start of the end, with probably the 2 worst teams in the league going head-to-head, and it was a blast. OK BRION taking on the NS RedForce, and NS picks up a win. Let's go! All of the bad teams are going to be in a circle. This is so fun. I mean, this series was a blast. Like, I'm not trying to sit here and shit on it. Neither of them played well, but that's kind of the best League of Legends, is when you have 2 pro teams that are just going balls to the wall, trying to make bad plays over and over again. Nongshim in this final game gave up Dragon Soul, Infernal Soul, in order for Elder to spawn a lot quicker, and then they just won the Elder fight and won the game. It's a ridiculous play that would not work in almost any other circumstance, but you know what? Nongshim pulled it off. They trusted their team fighting a bit more than bros, and, you know, they were right in that sense. Do I think that this was a good showing for Nongshim? No. I honestly think they played better earlier in the week against Gen.G, but you're able to win when you're playing against another team who also has really garbage macro, who also has no idea what to do, that honestly you are more talented than. And so, you know, I'm happy to see Nongshim get the win, but is this really a surprise? Now every single one of these teams is sitting at 3-13 in terms of their record, and that's just kind of what it is, right? The bottom 3 are all just one big circle of being bad. Whatever order you want to put them in, I think is relatively fair. So I won't spend too much time on this because it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is going to be Call Me, the mid laner for Nongshim. Let's go! Call Me had a good series in the LCK. This is the best he's ever played at the LCK level, and that's got to excite at least some people. I mean, Call Me was so good at in the Challengers League that you were hoping that he was going to make that transition a lot easier to the LCK. It's been an absolute disaster for him and for Nongshim. This position has been unplayable for them throughout most of this year, but him and Jiwoo really stepped up as carries in this one, and honestly, they kind of won through Call Me. I think without a lot of the pressure in the mid lane that he was able to generate, this series becomes a lot harder, specifically in Game 2 on the Tristana, but Game 3 on the Jace was also very good. You're kind of accentuating that with the fact that Jiwoo also had a great Game 3 on the Lucian. We've actually seen a lot more Lucian success over the course of this week than we have in recent months, and Lucian's one of those champions that I think is slowly just being phased out of pro play, but it can still be very effective if you can utilize it in the right circumstances. You don't always need to be, you know, prioritizing it super heavily in drafts, because, I mean, look at what happened to Bro in Game 2, but, you know, if you're aggressive in the mid game, if you want to try to take some of these trades, and, you know, if you want to try and skirmish a bit, which is the style that Nongshim does like to go for, then I actually think Lucian can still be relatively viable as a top tier ADC, as we saw from Jiwoo. But Jiwoo's made almost every ADC he's played look very good over the course of this year. He is so much better than everybody that he is playing with, maybe with the exception of Peter, who is also relatively good. Maybe not a star, but he's good, and he actually had a really good series here. Call Me, Jiwoo, and Peter were definitely the standouts for me, but, you know, you just got to be excited about Nongshim actually winning a series. It's been a while since they've done that. Din, you know, built Zhonya's on Renekton in Game 1 and got absolutely slaughtered, and then was a lot better towards the rest of the series. That's kind of indicative of how this has been. Sylvie was giving up dragons for free, like I was saying, giving up Infernal Soul for free, but it all ended up, you know, being fine because his team fighting was actually really good, and so it's just really weird. It's one of those series that I don't really know how to, you know, pull information out of. I don't know how to get an idea of how good these teams are because of it, because it was just so strange in terms of how Nongshim executed, but again, at least they were able to win the game. And then for Bro, they're not good. Like, just like Nongshim, they're also not good. They did try to make some aggressive plays. Morgan, I think, had a really good series. Great K'Sante game from him in game 1, but he actually kind of fell behind as the series continued to go along. The Udyr, the K'Sante for Dindin on the other side of the matchup was just more relevant than he was on either game of Aatrox here in the back half of the series, and that's definitely something to consider. I think Envy and Polu were actually fine, especially in comparison to what they had been normally. I don't love the Prio and Lucianami for this team in particular because it's not really their style, but the Kalista, Renata, I think actually does play into some of their advantages, and I think we did see that. Like, they were fine. Karis and Gideon were probably the two players that were the most outclassed. Karis could get dead of the series, but I think he was really good in that game 3 on the Tristana, and so I'm going to give it to Gideon in the jungle. Not a good week for Gideon. He is a player that I think has definitely trailed off as the split has continued to go along. Was really good at the beginning of the year. Maybe not really good, but was definitely the best player on Bro at the beginning of the year when things were just going wrong for this team everywhere else, and he's very much become a liability in the jungle. It's just kind of been the career pattern for Gideon. He's never really been consistent enough to keep a spot in a top league. That was the case in the LPL with Invictus, and that is the case here with Bro. Of course, the talent around him definitely doesn't help. You don't have a ton of winning lanes on this team, at least consistently, and so it's never going to make your life easier as a jungler, but Bro's just not a great team. 3-13 is indicative, and 3-13 is indicative of Nongshim as well. They are exactly who we thought they were. I'm actually glad to see this entire circle happen in the bottom part of the standings because all of these teams are so similar to me. They have upside, like Nongshim's got Jiwoo, and Bro's got Morgan, and DRX has Plata and Teddy, and, you know, some positives there. Like, each team has something that you can look at and be like, yeah, they're doing well in this aspect, and, you know, I think in different circumstances these players could be good, but because the LCK is so top heavy, it's so tough to play into those top 5 teams, you end up losing basically all of your games if you can't compete with them, and unfortunately that's where the bottom 3 are right now. So good win for Nongshim, not super consequential for Bro. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here, our second series of day number 5, and it is a good one. It's Dplus KIA taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G is going to pick up the win, but it's 2-1, and honestly, DK looked very good in this series. There is a lot to like about how DK was able to play a lot of these fights. Specifically, it's a lot of the players that we have been questioning for DK that have not necessarily been stepping up that I think were really big positives, namely Lucid, who was awesome in this series, but we'll get into that a bit later. We got to talk about Gen.G. First and foremost, winning this obviously isn't a huge surprise, but it is still nice to see them leaning on a lot of the things that got them here in the first place, continuing to play through the players that have dominated, and honestly, even be able to perform when not all 5 of their members are constantly in positive and advantageous positions in their matchup. I think that's the most encouraging thing that I saw out of Gen.G in this particular performance. Player of the series, no doubt, is going to Chovy. This one did not take much thought from me. The Talia, the Tristana, it's absurd just how good he is when he gets to play from ahead, and honestly, like, there's not a lot you can do to stop him from getting ahead in a lot of different circumstances. People can talk about the MVP race, but if you've made it this far, if you're an hour into this video, you can probably hear a little bit of a spoiler thing for the end of the year. Chovy's going to win the MVP for me, and he's going to win it in the LCK as well. Like, this guy's running away with the MVP race, in my opinion, and this has been a dominant split, and he continued to look awesome here. Showmaker's a very good mid laner who's having a very good split, and Chovy was up like 50 CS on him in the final game. It's genuinely ridiculous how much he is doing to destroy people. He's moving around the map, he's creating advantages for his jungler and for his teammates, while also just continuing to dominate his own individual 1v1. He's just not fair to play against. He really is that good. I do think Pays was also really good here. You know, he's kind of been better, I would say, over the second half, been more of a secondary player for Gen.G. A lot of attention has gone to Chovy and Canyon and Keen and even Lahens in the bot lane more than it's gone to Pays, but Pays has been fine. He's been solid all year long, if not spectacular. I do think that there were some concerns with how the top side played. Canyon had one of his worst series in a while. Not that he played horrible. I think some of his team fighting was actually pretty good, but being able to control the tempo, you know, just being able to actually set a lot of the precedent for how the series was going to go. I think Lucid did a better job than he did. His replacement actually beat him, and obviously these two have probably scrimmed against each other a lot over the years because Lucid was in the DK system when Canyon was the starting jungler for them, but Lucid clearly knew him inside and out. Like, he clearly knew how to beat him in terms of his pathing, and that was really good to see. We'll get into him in a bit, but Canyon, a little bit worse than he was earlier on in the week. Keen was actually really good in that final game on Udyr. I wish he did a bit more at the beginning of the series to stop Kingen from actually playing really well, but Keen was fine, especially towards the back half, but this was Chovy's series to win or lose. Pays obviously did a lot of work on the Lucian. You know, we're continuing to see that champion do well in game number 3, but I think Chovy really was the standout here. The Varus, by the way, in game game 2 as well was very good from Pays and from Lehens on the Tahm Kench, but Chovy was the star for me. And then for DK on the other side, you would have hoped that maybe they would have been a bit better in some certain areas, but I think generally you're walking out of this feeling positive about DK rather than negative. Yeah, could Showmaker have played better? Yes, he was the dud of the series, and Chovy just outplayed him, was up a ton in lane, and really wasn't able to actually do a whole ton in the game, and that's okay. Like, Showmaker is obviously somebody who's been such a positive for your team that you can live with him not playing perfect for one series. It is a concern that it's against Chovy, and maybe that's a sign that once they get into bigger matchups, once they start playing in the playoffs against these better teams, in best of fives, is Showmaker going to be able to hold up? That's something that is yet to be determined with this collection of players, but a lot of positives to take away from Lucid. I know I've talked about him so much, but he had an amazing series. Honestly, you could maybe make the argument that he was the best player in this series. He just couldn't quite get the job done in order to win a lot of these late game team fights, to win these games, but Lucid was awesome. This is maybe the best he's played in the LCK. This is somebody who has struggled, in my opinion, in 2024, but clearly that experience playing against Canyon in terms of being in the same organization came into effect here, because he took advantage of Canyon's mistakes and his pathing problems to just completely outpace him in the early game, and some of those kicks on Lee Sin were just perfection coming in from Lucid. If he plays like this for the rest of the year, DK is going to be a contender. Kingen was also really solid. I thought the Cassante games were fine, but the Gnar in game 1 was really good from him. That's a big positive. I think Kellen also was really good this series. The Thresh is actually kind of working out for people. I think that champion is really weak right now, but it's interesting to see, you know, people continue to move towards it because it's a comfort pick for basically every support in the world. But the Renata was also great. Aiming was a bit of a problem in terms of his positioning. Again, he's just not exactly the safest or most consistent player in the world, but again, for the most part, he was fine. Just a couple of pretty clear errors. I think Showmaker was really the only one who got just outplayed down the stretch, and that's honestly kind of a good sign for DK, that they in most roles can go up against a team like Gen.G and actually survive. Even if they weren't able to win it, they were able to keep it close. And for Gen.G, this is a good series. I mean, you're at 15-1. It's hard to really complain about a whole ton of things. You have the player that's probably running away with the MVP award in the mid lane. You've got Canyon, who might be first team All-Pro jungle. You have Keen, who's been awesome in the top lane. Lehens, who's been amazing in the support position. And Pays, who's been very consistent in the bot lane, if not, you know, very eye-catching in terms of the plays that he's been making. Gen.G is just a complete team. There's a reason this team is sitting at 15-1, and it's because they truly are one of the best in the world. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK week number 8 overview and analysis video. Of course, up on the screen now, you can see the updated LCK standings after 8 weeks of action. We've got a lot of highlighted teams. That's going to indicate a couple of things. Obviously, Gen.G in first place has qualified for top 2 at the very minimum here, a round 1 bye. No matter what for Gen.G, that's the worst they can do coming out of next week. But T1, Hanwha Life, KT, DK, they've all qualified. There's only one more playoff spot remaining, and it's between two teams that we will get into in just a second. Nongshim, DRX, and Bro obviously have officially been eliminated at 3 wins apiece. They cannot make the playoffs no matter what happens. You need at least 6 wins in order to get in, and that is guaranteed by the other 2 teams that are, or at least one of the teams. KDF is already at 6 wins, and so Nongshim, DRX, and Bro are out. The top 5 are already in. Gen.G's got their round 1 bye. We can go over my power rankings. We can go from number 1 to number 10, but not a lot of changes. Top 5 is going to stay the same here. Gen.G at 1, T1 at 2, Hanwha Life at 3. Maybe people are going to put HLE at 2 because of their win over T1, but I would expect in a best of 5 for T1 to still actually be able to get the edge on HLE. I just think that it's a lot closer to me than it was last week, and so, you know, I'm excited to say that, but I still need to see more. DK is going to stay at 4, and KT is going to stay at 5. I still don't trust the inconsistency of KT, and even with an 0-2 week for DK, I would expect a team like Damwon to actually be better, or Dplus KIA, sorry, I shouldn't call them Damwon. I would expect them to be better than a team like KT moving into the playoffs. I certainly would trust them more, but the bottom 5 all do kind of change in some way, shape, or form. I've actually got FearX moving up to number 6 in my power ranking because I do think they look better than KDF, and that was solidified with their win over them, and honestly, we'll talk about them in a second, but, you know, they've each got very different paths to get to the end of the split, and then bottom 3 kind of shuffling around. Nongshim's going to move up to 8 because of their win, and honestly, they look relatively okay, but again, bottom 3 is whatever. Like, Nongshim is 10 and 8. Bro is 10 and 8 and 9, and DRX is all of them as well. Like, they are all 8, 9, and 10. They are all the same team. They are all going to be inconsistently fine against each other and really bad against the teams that are better than them. That's just who all 3 of them are. None of them are competitive, and so they're going to be sitting at 8, 9, and 10 just in whatever order that you would want. But we're going to move into a little bit of a different segment, the playoff race segment, because we do have one playoff spot that is open for these 2 teams, KDF and FearX. FearX. We're at 6-10, we're at 5-11. You know, obviously there is a real circumstance this could come down to a really important race, and look at the remaining games for these two teams. KDF has to play DK and KT Rolster next week. Two top 5 teams that are going to be difficult to beat. Both of them are still playing for spots. They're playing for, you know, the 4 or 5 seed. They're playing to make sure that they can get, you know, advantage in the playoffs, and they're not going to be taking those series lightly. And FearX, the opposite, bottom 2 team, but like bottom 3 teams at the very worst, Nongshim and Bro, these are significantly easier games to win. If Fear can win both, if KDF end up losing both of those series, then Fox is in the playoffs. They're going to be the 6th seed, and that's very realistic. That's definitely a possibility. However, Fox doesn't have a great, you know, game differential. They don't have a great, like, actual in-game score differential, which means that, you know, let's say Fox only wins one of them. Let's say they get upset by Nongshim or something like that, and KDF, you know, maybe they don't even need to win a game. If they're both sitting at 6 and 12 going in, it's likely that KDF will actually have the better game differential, which is something to keep in mind. But again, FearX getting into the playoffs actually is a possibility for this team, and, you know, it's going to be necessary for them to win both, in my opinion. KDF, if they can win one, are going to be putting themselves in a pretty good position because of their game score. However, if they can win both, they're guaranteed to get in, and so definitely an interesting playoff race. But let me know who you think's going to take that 6th and final spot down in the comment section below. But it's time to move into my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week number 8. And player of the week, not a difficult one for me. It's going to go to Chovy, the mid laner for Gen.G. He just continues to absolutely dominate. First player of the week of the season, which is shocking, but I think he's been a runner-up almost every single week. Like, this guy has dominated every single game that Gen.G has played, even if he's not the primary focus for what they do. He's just been unbelievable. Again, my MVP favorite right now, moving into the final week of the season. But the honorable mentions, the runner-ups this week for player of the week, Clear, the top laner for FearX. Really liked how Clear played in both series that they ended up winning. I think Clear was a pretty influential part of both of those series, and I wanted to give him credit here. He has gotten better against bad teams, which I think is a good sign. And Delight, the support for HLE, you know, Delight's really good, and he had a really good week. HLE in general had a good week. If you want to put Zeka here as the HLE representative, I think that that's relatively fine. In fact, honestly, you could put Execute here as the FearX representative, and I wouldn't think too poorly of that either. There were a lot of players who played well this week, but Chovy is going to get my official player of the week. And then dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Gideon, the jungler for Bro. You know, I liked Gideon at the beginning of the split. He was the only one on Bro that I was actually saying was playing well. Morgan's obviously gotten back into form, but Gideon, I think, has really started to take a nosedive in terms of the performances that he has offered. He has become one of the worst players on the team as the split has gone along. And again, this is a kind of a career trend for him, where he starts off splits strong and relatively good, and then just continues to fade as things continue to go along. Not sure why that ends up being the case for him, but it certainly is something to monitor. So dud of the week is going to go to Gideon, and player of the week is going to go to Chovy. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comments section below. Leave a like on this video if you did like it. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCK. There's playoffs going on in North America right now. They're about to start here in Korea. They're about to start in China. They're about to start in Europe. We cover all of those major regions, and so if you're curious and interested in all that's going on in LoL Esports right before MSI, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all